Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Last month, in celebration of the BookTube event Horror Mayhem, I read a short story by Stephen King. This month, in honor of June on the Range, I picked up my very first Western, the novel True Grit by Charles Portis. I very much enjoyed the book, but I was left with a couple of questions. When I first told a BookTube friend about my idea of trying out a few books totally outside my comfort zone, like horror and westerns, he suggested that no matter how open-minded I tried to be, chances were high that I would critique them based on the same standards I apply to literary fiction or to classics. And I may be doing that despite my best efforts to avoid it, since I really don't know the standards of their genres. But for today, let me start by telling you about some of the aspects of this novel that I loved. First, the main character is a spunky young woman, 14 years old, I think. I just mentioned in my last video that I love spunky young women, partly because I always wanted to be one, and partly because I read so many novels with spunky young women as main characters. Jo March in Little Women, and Laura Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie, Anne Shirley in Anne of Green Gables, Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, and of course Jane Eyre, who I apparently must mention in every video. Those characters shaped how I thought about my own gender back when I was young. Maddie Ross, the young protagonist of True Grit, more or less fits in with these other characters. Maddie is fierce and independent and ready for pretty much any kind of adventure. And she insists that other people, including adult men, should take her seriously. Actually, Maddie is much fiercer than the other fictional heroines I just mentioned. After her father dies, she's seeking retribution, seeking to have his murderer hunted down and killed. But the fierceness is slightly tongue-in-cheek. If I had children who went off and did what she did, I would be terrified about their safety. But that's not at all what we feel when we read this. We're excited about the adventure she's about to go on, but we've already seen that she is in control of the situation. And while it's going to be an intense situation, we pretty much know, or at least feel, that things are going to be okay in the end. There is a very clear sense of humor and lightness that comes across on the page. Some of you may not be surprised that I chose a novel specifically focused on a female character. It shouldn't be necessary for me to, quote, see myself in a narrative, right? Still, when I read a novel that includes no women or only stereotypes, it's hard to feel like the author really expects women to read the work. I'm sure that is true for all readers of all stripes who don't see themselves regularly represented in fiction. But I do think there's something about gender that makes absence especially pointed. Men and women do not typically live in socially segregated situations. Men have mothers, many have sisters and female lovers and daughters and the like. There are only a few historical situations where women really wouldn't be present, maybe in military situations in particular times, etc. But there are certainly genres that create situations where women don't really show up on the page, at least not in any significant way. The decision not to include women in a novel mostly goes against the daily life experience of most people. I have a lot of thinking to do about how and why to read books that don't include women, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this issue. But regardless, this novel, True Grit, is a Western that quite deliberately chooses to include a key female character, one who isn't cast with traditional stereotypes either. Charles Portis published True Grit in the very late 1960s, during the Summer of Love, I think, when Vietnam and civil rights and feminism were on everyone's minds. But the main part of the story takes place 100 years earlier, in Arkansas and the Indian Territory that became Oklahoma. While that timing definitely meant that authors had started thinking more about depictions of race and gender, etc., fiction published in the late 1960s still featured a variety of prejudices and social situations we probably wouldn't feature today. For example, Maddie is whipped by an adult man who is not a villain in the book. We also see someone make what almost feels like a threat of rape by an adult man. That sounds horrific, but it's just tossed off here, not dangerous, or even creepy, really. I think what the author was trying to do in both of these scenes was show that Maddie was not respected by the men in the early parts of the novel. Over the course of the novel, that fact changes. As I said earlier, Maddie's father has been murdered, and the way she's going in search of vengeance, which is the right word here, I think, an eye for an eye retribution, is by hiring a U.S. Marshal as well as a Texas Ranger. I'm not going to explain why they're both involved, but they are not completely on the same side. And not surprisingly, they're not exactly eager to have a young girl accompany them on their mission. So one part of the plot is how these three manage to come together and become a team. Maddie chooses them, especially one of the men, specifically because she believed that particular man was the strongest and most committed fighter, not necessarily the one most committed to justice or the most successful at his job even. Instead, it was because he had grit, true grit, meaning not necessarily being the best at something, but instead being a person who doesn't give up easily. The book never explicitly calls Maddie a person with true grit, but obviously that is partly what we see here. Maddie belongs in a Western novel specifically because she embraces what is in many ways a supposedly masculine role or persona. Still, I think it's important to recognize here that she's not just showing bravery. Instead, she's responding from grief and her yearning to put things to rights again and make things equal. Sort of a, you killed my father, prepare to die. I find it interesting that at one point in True Grit, Maddie is reading a novel about another girl who has lost her father, a girl who expresses much more conventional gender roles. It's quite funny to have Maddie reading something conventional while living something much more transgressive and exciting, almost certainly the opposite of what most of the readers of True Grit are doing. It isn't a spoiler to say that the three main characters become a devoted team, nor is it a spoiler to say that the good guys win, which I assume is a typical feature of the genre. But I'll let you discover for yourself how the ending comes about. There's some very interesting imagery in this book. I'll mention just a couple of examples. First, the bad guy in the book has a black mark on his face, which even Maddie herself recognizes as a reference to the mark of Cain, who in the Jewish Bible or the Old Testament kills his brother. For those of you who know your Bible, you might remember that the black mark is supposed to be protection from vengeance in the original. There's also a situation where I'm just going to say that Maddie enters something that stands for the pit of hell. Unlike Dante and like Aeneas, she returns from hell, but she has to pay a certain kind of price, one that keeps her from being the, quote, strong right arm that would support her family and give them comfort after the death of her father. It strikes me that this book is thinking critically about how Westerns were created. That is, True Grit looks back on the history of the creation of the mythology of the West quite consciously. I haven't said it yet, but the narrator is telling the story from much later, giving the narrative after visiting a Western fair or festival, perhaps the beginning of the cultural creation of the myth of the Wild West in post-frontier times, when that idea of an open America full of opportunity for white people was starting to seem more closed down. It's not all that uncommon for contemporary critics to list this book as a possible contender for the title Great American Novel. I can see why people might argue for that. But fundamentally, something that is necessary in literary fiction is character development. And in Jane Eyre and in Little Women, etc., we see our main character grow and change over the course of the novel. Here in True Grit, we don't get that psychological growth. The Maddie we see at the end, even though she has aged and experienced things, has not grown and changed in any clear way, I don't think. Don't get me wrong, we do see some emotionally powerful moments. One that is sort of a classic image of a pietà, maybe, and one where one of the men is given the honor of standing as true family to her. But she doesn't grow, and I think that keeps it from being a contender for the great American novel. Well, despite this little quibble, I very much enjoyed this novel, and I'm glad I tried it out. Thanks for joining me today as I babbled a little bit about it. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.